Welcome everyone. My name is Rayla Bellis. I'm the Director of Thriving Communities at Smart Growth America. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar / conversation about how to carry forward lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, building on this field scan that we just recently released, shared spaces and health equity. I'll just give some quick logistical announcements before we kind of jump into the substance of this. The session is being recorded. We will be putting that recording on our website within a couple days or so of this session, as well as our YouTube channel. You will get an email when it's live as participants in the webinar. We are striving to make our Zoom events as accessible as we can. So we have an ASL interpreter here with us today. Thrilled to have her joining us. We also have the option for live captioning through Zoom. You can access that by going to the menu at the bottom of your screen, clicking on the live transcript option, and then you can either view those as subtitles or within a separate window. And then we're hoping to make this session a bit interactive. So we will have some presentation, but we're going to be doing some polling as part of that. So we'd love to hear from you all about some of the COVID responses that you saw in your community and what you would carry forward post-pandemic. And then we'll also have some time for question and answer at the end. So you can use the question feature within Zoom. I believe you have the option to actually upvote questions that you see, which is pretty cool. So go ahead and put questions in at any time and we will get to them at the end. Just very quickly, in case you aren't familiar with our organization, Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit. This is our mission. We believe that no matter who you are or where you live, you should be able to enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. We're also a collection of various programs that have their own more specific missions that help support this broader mission, some of which you may be familiar with in your work, the National Complete Streets Coalition, the Form-Based Code Institute, Transportation for America, and so on. And we do our work in several ways. We work across different policy areas. We work in transportation, land use, economic development policy, equitable development. We do technical assistance in communities around the country. We work with states around the country as well. We do a fair amount of federal advocacy to shape federal policy and funding programs. And then we also do reports, research like this field scan, as well as major events to bring leaders in the field and people who experience the policies that we advocate for together to shape the smart growth movement. This report, so we did this field scan over the course of about a year. We knew that many wonderful innovations in terms of how we use public space, shared space, transportation came out of the pandemic. We also know that many of those rapid responses were not implemented in ways that benefited the people that most needed that support. The people that were hardest hit by the pandemic, people who are lower income, people of color didn't necessarily receive the same investment, especially initially during the pandemic. So we wanted to dig into that and try to synthesize some lessons from what different communities saw during the pandemic. So we did a scan of about 400 policies and initiatives around the country that were implemented during the pandemic. We also interviewed several nonprofit leaders, some of which are here with us today and will be joining us in this conversation, and hopefully I will speak pretty quickly so that they have a good amount of time to share their insights, which we really appreciated. So we developed this scan based on a combination of evaluating initiatives around the country and speaking with leaders. And this field scan is called Shared Spaces and Health Equity. We looked at a variety of pandemic interventions that have to do with transportation and use of public space. As we did this study, we looked at things like slow streets, closing streets for vehicles, but also things like reallocating curb space for different uses, things like opening up outdoor space in streets and sidewalks for businesses to operate, things like relaxing regulations and how we use public space, and changes to public transit. So we looked at a bunch of different pandemic-related responses. And I wanted to mention our partner in all of this work and a lot of our work at Smart Growth America, the CDC, specifically the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity and Obesity through the Active People Healthy Nation initiative was our funder for this work. The Active People Healthy Nation initiative is an effort to get 27 million Americans more physically active by 2027. through strategies to help provide access to physical activity. And our work with the CDC and the work of a lot of organizations that we partner with is about increasing options for physical activity as a part of daily trips and daily life, not simply recreational exercise, but also opportunities to get that physical activity through trips to work, trips to the grocery store, trips to healthcare, other daily travel. So thank you to the CDC for their support. And I wanted to give a shout out to the team that worked on this field scan really quickly. I'm talking, but I was not the primary author or researcher for this work. I want to especially thank Anush Thacker and Martina Guglielmone for their research and their writing. They really led this effort, provided a lot of the strategic direction, and did a wonderful job. And then as well as the editors also shown on the slide. And we had the input of some great key informants throughout this process at several key points, two of which are here with us today and will be speaking shortly. Michelle Lieberman with the Safe Routes to School Partnership and Mike McGinn with America Walks. They provided their insights. We're so grateful for their input. I also wanted to be sure to thank our other key informants as we developed this field scan, Dara Baldwin with the Center for Disability Rights and Bill Nesper with the League of American Bicyclists, who also provided wonderful input and insights that contributed to this field scan. Okay, so again, part of what we wanted to really dig into with this field scan is some of the responses that we started to hear after cities initially rolled out their pandemic responses. Residents and advocates rightly started to raise questions like this. Who were these responses intended to benefit? Where were they located? Were they prioritizing the people that we had identified as essential during the pandemic, or were they prioritizing people like 9-to-5 workers, wealthier residents? Was the neighborhood that was receiving the investment in something like a slow street consulted, or were they not necessarily consulted until after the fact? And of course, these are rapid responses by necessity. So there's a limited amount of that can happen to some extent, but advocates and community members rightly raised that didn't happen in many cases. So we, again, dug in. We found 6 systemic barriers that we synthesized through this research, many of which you may have seen in your communities. These are systemic barriers. They did not appear during the pandemic. These all existed before the pandemic, but some of them were exacerbated during the pandemic. Some of them received more public attention during the pandemic, maybe the attention that they deserve to receive all along. The first is limited community engagement, of course, between rapid budget cuts, the impossibility of doing in-person engagement, the need for rapid responses. In many cases, community engagement was limited or essentially non-existent as cities rolled out pandemic responses. Some cities, though, did adjust their approach after they received some initial feedback, and we're going to hear a little bit more about some examples of that shortly from some of our guest speakers. I'm going to go through these quickly. Lack of accessibility. So as we reallocated sidewalk space to things like outdoor dining, sometimes that came at the expense or the deprioritization of sidewalks actually serving their primary function of allowing people to travel through the area, both people walking, but also people using wheelchairs and other assistive devices. Many cities received a lot of complaints initially about this. Philadelphia, for example, received almost 30 complaints within the first month about sidewalk blockages and obstructions, and the causes were a combination of lack of clear regulations at all about how this should be handled as businesses were rolling out outdoor dining, or regulations that simply weren't held up, essentially, that businesses weren't actually following and that the city wasn't really checking up on, which in Philadelphia's case, they did have requirements around this. It just, a lot of businesses either didn't know or weren't upholding them. Cycles of disinvestment, by which we mean the places, again, that tended to receive these initial investments were often those that had more access to parks and open space to begin with, had more capital, usually higher income. Many of the places that were most in need of support, that were hardest hit by the pandemic, that had the highest population densities or the tightest packed housing, didn't necessarily receive these initial investments. New York was a city that was a very early adopter of slow streets during the pandemic and received some initial pushback for this. This is a map from the Trust for Public Land. You can see the red and orange Areas were identified as places in need of more access to parks through a combination of not only the current parks in the area, but also factors like population density, presence of children in the area, percentage of low-income houses, and the black lines were the initial slow street locations, and you can see they're in fairly park-rich areas. Fourth, loss of public transit service. So as budgets got slashed, tax revenues dwindled, resources got reallocated. Many transit agencies also lost drivers as a result of the pandemic. Transit cuts were widespread, obviously. Many places are still feeling the effects of these transit cuts. And of course, the people who were most negatively impacted were the people who are transit dependent, who were still going to work during the pandemic. Many of those people continue to be impacted by these cuts. Some transit agencies have used the pandemic to launch processes to think about how to restructure service to meet the needs and prioritize the needs of some of those essential workers. But many transit agencies continue to struggle with limited resources, low morale, lack of drivers. This is an ongoing problem. Fifth barrier, rigid regulations for the use of public space, specifically for businesses. As the pandemic started, a lot of people turned to new ways of trying to make revenue through at-home businesses. Initially, a lot of these people ran into inflexible regulations in how public space is used. Some of this prompted changes. For instance, this example in Seattle, where a woman got basically a zoning code violation for operating out of her garage, that ended up prompting changes, but continued to be a barrier in many places. And then finally, inequitable law enforcement. This, of course, impacts who feels safe on our streets and in our parks and in our public spaces. But we also saw a lot of specific examples of inequitable enforcement of COVID orders specifically. People of color were 2.0 times more likely to be policed and punished for violations of stay-at-home orders and social distancing orders, and Black people specifically were 4.5 times more likely than white people to be punished or policed for those violations. So I think we may need to unfortunately skip these polls. So we'll see if we can come back to them later in the process if I can work out these technical issues. So moving on from the barriers, part of what we want to have a conversation about today basically is what can we carry forward from some of these lessons, some of the lessons that we highlighted in our field scan, but also some other lessons that our guest speakers are going to highlight as well. So I just wanted to highlight a few things. So the team who's speaking on this webinar was reflecting about how it really feels like a lot of what we saw during the pandemic has returned to the pre-pandemic normal alarmingly quickly. But there are some things that we know have lasted that should be shaping how we're making decisions moving forward. One is this major uptick in demand for walking during the pandemic. All 100 of the largest metro areas saw an increase in walking trips during the pandemic, with an average of almost a 50% increase. And this is a little bit of a teaser of a report that we're going to be releasing in about a month called Dangerous by Design that looks at pedestrian safety. But many places also saw basically an uptick in people walking being struck and killed during the pandemic. Some places didn't, and the places that didn't tended to be places that already had high walking commute mode share. So the share of people walking to work was relatively high. So these places had safer infrastructure and development patterns that allowed people to walk to work, and those places didn't see the same uptick in deaths. So there's something that we can learn from that, I think. We also are starting to see these polls showing that there's an increased demand for some of these changes that we saw as temporary during the pandemic. This was an example from the Boston area, overwhelming support for more space for outdoor dining, for more separated bike lanes that aren't exposed to traffic, wider sidewalks, more space for public art. So, and I think we'll probably continue to see research like this showing some of these changes in preferences and desires. But then on the flip side, we know that a lot of especially some of the bigger response programs were not made permanent. So this is an example looking at open street programs around the country. 84% were designated as temporary all along. 18 were being considered to be made permanent status as of about a year ago, but 94% only lasted 6 months. So many of these programs were designed to be temporary and have not been made permanent. So it's possible there are some opportunities there. And then finally, we know that the nature of downtowns, especially in our major urban areas, has really changed, and in a way that we may continue to see moving forward as more people are working remote or hybrid and are going to be continuing to do so. We need to rethink what we should be doing in our downtowns to make them vibrant places that people want to be. And this is, of course, part of the issue, is that in many downtowns in large metro areas, the development is overwhelmingly office space, very little housing, very little retail. I think a lot of cities pre-pandemic in their core business district had sort of this issue of kind of feeling a little bit dead, other than the 9 to 5 Monday through Friday work hours. That is certainly more the case in many cities. So what can we do to make these vibrant places that people want to live and want to go, recognizing that we may never see the same work context that we did before the pandemic. So these are the 6 lessons that we profiled during the pandemic. And I won't read them, I'll just sort of quickly summarize. Being multidisciplinary in how we approach these issues, especially with public health, but also with other disciplines and partners. Deploying temporary projects to test solutions with the right community engagement practices in place, so that you're actually building trust through those projects and showing that you can make changes in response to what the community says. Committing significant resources to community engagement to really build that trust, so that when you have situations that require rapid response, you have the trust in place. You also have the context in place of the community's perspectives from a long-standing relationship. Actually considering how different groups and populations and neighborhoods experience streets and public space and relate to streets and public space, and building that awareness into our processes as decision makers or advocates. Instituting more flexibility in regulations governing public space, so that we're actually accommodating evolving community needs and being responsive. And then finally, and this is sort of one that we haven't touched on before, this wasn't just a thing in big cities. Rural and small towns also saw major increases in walking. They saw this increased demand. They also need solutions for better transportation access and more options for active travel. So this word cloud, I think, and I'm actually going to, at this point, transition to Michelle. Michelle's going to talk about community engagement and some insights. She provided wonderful input about this in our field scan, and so she's going to share some examples from her work with the Safe Routes Partnership.
Great. Thanks, Rayla. Let's share my screen. All right. So I wanted to circle back to one of the lessons in the report, and that was lesson 3, commit significant resources to ongoing community engagement in ways that build trust in the community's key audiences. And I think, as Rayla mentioned, one of the challenges that we saw during the pandemic was with these rapid response efforts, whether they be open streets or pop-up bike lanes, or even things like outdoor dining, that there was very little or no community engagement. And it's not even just that the engagement wasn't happening in the moment when these rapid responses were taking place, but that communities didn't have the underlying foundation of having long-term relationships and trust and community engagement, between the residents and the city agencies, to really allow those rapid responses to happen in a way that would really reflect the community's needs and really respond to the community's needs. And so a lot of what we saw was these, it resulted in inequitable outcomes with oftentimes Black and Brown communities, residents who were low income or working in the service industries, the folks that we said their jobs are essential. These projects weren't serving them. And one could argue that these really were the community members that we should be trying to serve with these projects. So I wanted to share some of the examples where agencies and organizations took different approaches to community engagement that really benefited the relationships, and they were really working towards this long-term model of building trust and really having a foundation of ongoing community engagement. So I'll start with one example from the report, and this is the Oakland slow streets. And I titled this "Listen, Learn, and Change," which is what I feel like they really did. And so, you've probably read in the report or read elsewhere that Oakland was one of the first places to roll out a slow streets program during the pandemic and start implementing these on what the plan was to put it on a number of streets throughout the city. And as they got going, they were really getting a lot of pushback, understanding that they weren't considering all of the community members, that most of the feedback and input was from the more affluent and white communities. And so the city really took it to heart, and they pivoted and made specific efforts to outreach to Black community members, to low-income communities or neighborhoods, and make changes. They were willing to listen, to learn, and then make the changes to their program. So that way it was more equitable and accessible, and really benefiting all members of their community. So that was one example from the report. I also wanted to share two examples that were really not related to rapid response interventions, but other groups that were putting community priorities first. And during this time, during the pandemic, they were continuing to build community relationships and really sort of pivoting their efforts to meet communities where they are at. And I think it's really benefited them. So first is the Portland Safe Routes to School program. They've historically been working on walking and biking and getting kids walking and biking to school, but they really pivoted to address community needs first. And so they partnered with the Street Chest to help with food distribution, and use their traditional bike safety and biking skills to make that service available for community members. They were really pivoting to address a critical community need. And I love this quote from one of their Safe Routes to School specialists. In this time, it's important for us to be flexible. This is how we can serve communities in this crisis, and access to resources like food is a transportation need. So expanding beyond their, kind of historical mission and focus, it wasn't about pushing the Safe Routes to School goals of getting more kids walking and biking. It was really about making sure those community needs are met. And along the way, they found that food delivery was a way for their program to continue building relationships with the residents, the community members, as well as their school staff. They had, worked with a lot of these school community partnerships before, but they had been typically asking, hey, help us out, get people, to our program or participate in our program. And this was turning around to say, what do you need? What can we help you with? How can we put these community priorities first, knowing in the long term that it'll benefit our relationships in the community? And then the last example I wanted to share really quickly is from a great program in Savannah, Georgia. They started a Healthy Walks program, and Healthy Savannah has an initiative to make people get more active, be more physically active throughout the region. And this Healthy Walks was part of it. But it grew out of just a desire for their employees to get out and walk together. And after a while, they found that, this is something that they really benefited from internally. How could they take this and take it out to the community? So they actually started live streaming on Facebook, their walks, and, using it as an opportunity to connect with community members, to sort of, meet them on the platform that they wanted to participate in. They were able to take different walks in different parts of the city, share new places, talk about important things about, challenges around mobility, areas that needed improvements. They were essentially, for those of us in the transportation world, they were kind of doing these light walk audits of sort with community members. But really, again, thinking about it not in terms of what was their priority, what did they want to get out of it, but how could they bring the community in and address this community desire to participate in something virtually. So I think one of the things that our organization has really been thinking about is what do we do in this next phase of coming out of the pandemic? And I think we've come to the conclusion that community engagement matters now more than ever. For all of these reasons, building and rebuilding connectedness, prioritizing needs, increasing the participation, and creating a roadmap for more equitable decisions and priorities. So, I think the pandemic really did reemphasize that community engagement is important. And that it can't just be a check the box one-time activity, but there has to be, coming back to that lesson, significant resources in ongoing community engagement that's building trust. So if you haven't started already, I would say start now before you're asked to respond to another crisis, respond in a rapid fashion. So that way you have that baseline understanding of the community, those relationships, that trust. It just makes it so much easier to have a response that is appropriate and really meeting community needs. So I wanted to leave everyone with a couple of resources. First is a community engagement toolkit that our organization put together, and I'll actually give a shout out to my colleague, Corey Johnson, who was the author on this. And it outlines a community engagement framework, a lot of best practices, case studies, resources. But this guide is not necessarily about how to, set up your seats at a workshop, although it has some logistics to it and some of those considerations. But what I love about it, it really covers how to get to know a community, how to build trust, and how to do all the things that you need to do before you even have what you might call your formal community engagement activities. So here's the framework. And the other tool I wanted to share was from the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative at Kent State University. And they put together this lessons from the pandemic all around community engagement, understanding that folks did try out hybrid engagement models, did try out virtual engagement models. So it has a lot of case studies and lessons learned around specific tools and techniques that you might want to take a look at. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Rayla.
Thank you so much, Michelle, especially for giving examples of how to approach that ongoing community engagement that isn't necessarily project specific, but actually starts to build those relationships. I think some of those examples were so valuable. So we'll go ahead and kick it to Mike, and then we'll have plenty of time, I think, for Q&A at the end. So Mike McGinn with America Walks, he's the executive director. He is also a former elected official from Seattle. He was the mayor during the recession. So he's going to be providing that perspective as he reflects on some of his takeaways from the pandemic, as well as his role as a longtime advocate for some of these issues.
Cool. I guess my screen is up, right? My slideshow's up.
Looks great.
Cool. Yeah. So yes, I'm the executive director of America Walks, been in the job a couple of years. And just really briefly, our goal is to work with local communities and support advocacy around safe, equitable, accessible, and enjoyable places to walk and move. And we're a voice for walkability at the national level. And I was also an elected official during 4 years. So, kind of have some experience with, issues arising and government having to respond quickly and how they do that and what that means. And clearly something like the pandemic, the way I think about it, it was a stress test for local government, and it affects both policy, to the degree to which the city has thought through or local government has thought through what does it want in the long term around process clearly and around equity. And all of those things were present there. I want to echo and amplify Michelle's comment about the need to be working on the processes and policies and understanding community needs as an ongoing activity. I mean, there's a reason why in schools you do fire drills, because you don't want to try to figure out how you're going to get all the kids out of the school when there's an actual fire. So learning that muscle memory of working with community is just critically important. And boy, listening to Michelle got me thinking and remembering a number of things. One important lesson we learned was all too often community engagement is you go to the community and say, what are the things we need to do about our job differently? Like how should we design this street, or how should we do this? And oftentimes the most important question to ask people is, what do you need? What is it that you need to succeed? And then you can start looking for the policy solutions. I'll give one example of that. We did an outreach on what do your children need to learn and be better in school. One of the things was dental care. Like, we would not have thought about that with a school. We ended up launching a dental care program in the schools because you can't learn, if you have a toothache. And it sounds really simple, but that active listening is just critically important and has to be ongoing. So it's worth taking a look at some of the interventions to kind of reflect then on how this worked. So open streets were obviously adopted in a lot of places. It was responding to people's desire to have outdoor spaces for exercise, mental health, et cetera. Clearly, there were issues with, as was already outlined around equity, but it also, the very process itself was an opportunity for public engagement and feedback. And that's something that a crisis gives you when you get that opportunity. But again, you'll be better off if you've already been engaging the community about their needs. It's interesting to compare it to the outdoor dining situation. Lots of places were not able to do open streets in neighborhoods for movement, but outdoor dining was extremely popular. And I'd ask people to kind of reflect on the constituency here. And it was not at all surprising to me that the outdoor dining and reworking of downtown streets moved so quickly, because every local elected official is very cognizant of the health of the local businesses, for good reasons. So you just saw places move a lot quicker there. And that's illustrative. And I think the last one to look at and think about is transit. And this is a slide that Transportation for America used, which is affiliated and part of Smart Growth America, and thank goodness for their efforts to get federal dollars, because federal transit funding, locally had cratered as ridership went down. But what was fascinating about this is at the same time that support for transit was declining, we were saying that the people who needed transit, oftentimes low-wage workers coming in from the suburbs, which was where housing was affordable, were relying on that transit to get to and from the jobs that were deemed to be essential to be filled. So there's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison. Opening up streets, making streets available for businesses to use, a lot of that is policy change, not dollars, but it is reflective of prioritization of issues. Now, when we talk about engagement, we often focus on, best practices for agency officials and community organizations that are participating in that. And that's really important stuff. And a lot of the guidelines and suggestions are important. But I just want to make another point, which is that these agency officials are working within a context, a political context. And their direction often does come from the elected officials. And the question then is, who is in the ear of the elected officials? Who are the elected officials paying attention to? And so this is an issue that I've thought quite a bit about, and I don't know how often people think about this issue or reflect on it. One of the things we know is that turnout in local elections is very low. This is a graph from whoVotesForMayor.org, as a project of Portland State University. I recommend going into it. I'm sure you can't see the little numbers, but in the places, by the time you get to the fourth city, to the right there, that's 35% and below. So that's your turnout in voting for mayor. In fact, way over here at Bellis, it's 6%. So that's a huge issue, is that turnout is so low. And you might wonder why it's so low in so many places. And the biggest reason is in the US, what's known as the progressive era, around the beginning of the 1900s, many local elections were moved to odd years, ostensibly to allow people to focus on local elections, but it had the effect of really depressing turnout. And this is a graph from Sightline, which has a lot of writings on this. I'd recommend taking a look at it, sightline.org. And what they saw is that when you held county elections in even years in Oregon or Washington, you had you had up to almost 60% voting. When you held it in odd years, you were down in that below 40% voting. Now, it's not just the number of people that votes, it's then who shows up to vote. And I want you to think back to the fact that streets were opened in single-family residential neighborhoods for active recreation, and businesses got a greater use of the street, and transit dropped. What we know is that the dip in voting amongst communities of color is far higher than it is among white voters. And again, this is another chart from Sightline that I invite you to look at. This is a chart from a Washington Post article talking about Ferguson, Missouri. That was the town where Michael Brown was shot and killed. And it is, I believe, it is a white minority population. And if you take a look at this graphic, it shows that in the 2012 November election, a presidential election, the number of white voters and black voters was about even. But if you look at the following year, the number of whites voting were more than twice the number of black people voting in that election. And this is something that can be seen across cities. I'm not picking on Ferguson here. This is a common issue here. This is another one, which is the age difference between the voters and the adult population, the average age of the voters versus the average age of the adult population. This on the far left here, it's almost 25 years difference. The voters are that much older than the average population, and most of them it's 10 years older. So whose needs are going to be responded to most quickly in a crisis like this? Who are the people that the elected official not only hears more from, but maybe spending more time with as they are seeking to prepare for the next election coming around, and city council members as well? So I raise all these points just to say that there's a structural aspect to local elections in that needs to be looked at when we talk about representation, because it would be better practices are essential, better retentions are essential, but this is a type of structural change. And when you consider how local governments control land use and local streets, as well as local policing, all of the data we show about the inequity that occurs within cities. And again, these inequities can occur at other levels of government and do occur at other levels of government. We have our own issues with our federal system. But when you look at the really dramatic differences in turnout and composition of the electorate in local elections, if you care about greater equity, I think this is one of a structural issue that we need to think about as well. As we approach so many of the issues that cities need to address to really thrive for all. And I'll close there.
Thank you, Mike. I have a couple questions, one or two questions for both of you to get us started. But before we do that, Anushka is going to show the results of our previous polls, and we'll do the two that we missed to see if that prompts any questions. As a reminder, you can use the question feature to ask any questions for our speakers. You can also put them in the chat. We can see that as well. So whichever you would prefer. And go ahead, Anushka, let's see the initial polls. This one, I'll say, didn't surprise me too much, these results. This is sort of how I would have guessed that this spread would look like in terms of which interventions we saw. You just go ahead to the next one. This one actually did surprise me a little bit. It seems like the outdoor dining, if I'm interpreting this correctly, seemed to be a really popular one, which perhaps isn't that surprising, but is controversial, at least in my own community currently, where we're sort of having this debate between parking space versus other use of the sidewalk versus the outdoor dining. Why don't we go ahead to the 2 remaining word clouds? Okay, so we've talked about a bunch of barriers at this point. You don't need to remember the exact list that we shared in our presentation, but you probably remember the gist. Go ahead and add, oh, yeah, let's just do this one. Okay, so, okay, so what additional lessons would you add to the ones that we've been talking about so far? So this can be sort of related to a barrier. This can also be a takeaway that you think should be carried forward into the pandemic. This is a word cloud again. So the same idea, you type a stream of consciousness, a list of words or phrases, and they will show up as a word cloud. And we think because Anushka is sharing her screen, they should actually show up this time.
Maybe the poll everywhere or poll system. Okay. It's not working.
All right, well, perhaps this time is the charm, but we don't have time. So I'm sorry, everyone, but thank you for those that put your comments in the chat. How frustrating. So I had a question or two, Mike and Michelle, for you. First, so we've talked about the importance of putting significant resources to community engagement. That is extremely necessary. I think it's also challenging. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on what are some relatively easy lifts that perhaps aren't necessarily being continued consistently in this era as we start to recover from the pandemic? And is there anything that we can do that's a relatively easy lift that places should be thinking about and doing right now? Any thoughts on that? Mike, you're on. Yeah.
I think one of the things to think about is we oftentimes ask the issue experts to go out there and do the engagement, or we retain, an outside firm. We meaning, the city governments that are out there or the county governments. They retain a firm to do it, and oftentimes your best, the people who best understand the needs of the community are within the community. So I know that a number of cities do this, which is they retain community experts to do the engagement and to do that engagement in the places where people already are. And again, with the asking the question, not a technical question about what the policy is, but the open-ended question about that own person's expertise, which is, what are the obstacles that you face in your daily lives that you could use help with? And in the city of Seattle, it was called the Principal Outreach and Engagement Liaison Program, or POLs. And I just want to say these folks were just absolutely fabulous as a way of doing engagement. And again, it was not requiring the community to come to a meeting, although we did ones like that, but going to the community where the community was already gathering and being present to actively listen with somebody who knew that community and could introduce you and help you with the engagement, and pay that person. Don't just ask the local nonprofits to do the engagement for you, or the local people to do it because it should be in their interest. Put money in the budget, pay people to do the engagement for you, because you're paying your own folks to do it. You should pay community members to do it.
Yeah, I was going to say everything is an engagement opportunity. It's just that active listening. I think it can be built into everything, any sort of interaction. And so, yeah, if there's the ability to make sure that's being done, and that you're not treating community engagement as it's a separate thing that happens once, and it's a very, specific, rigid activity. I think that opens the opportunities to have more engagement, better engagement too.
And do either of you have thoughts on this great point that Susan made in the chat about engagement fatigue? Basically, people are tired, they're frustrated, they're burned out. That is a very true reality that we're all facing. What, if anything, can we do to help address that reality?
Yeah. Don't give out more surveys for people to take. Nobody wants to do another survey.
I think there also has to be a trust building aspect of the engagement, right? People have to see that the feedback they gave translated into an activity, and I think I did over 100 town halls when I was mayor. And when we came back to it, and these were completely open town halls, come one, come all. But one of the things was that if you came back to the second meeting and you hadn't ticked a couple of things off the checklist of concerns, that was going to be a problem at the next meeting. You had to, there's a cycle to this, which is that the first meeting, everybody really, wants to lay out what's bugging them. And the second meeting, they're coming in with a lot of skepticism that anything's going to change. So I really think that you have to demonstrate the ability to act on it. It's not the engagement itself is not enough. And there's usually on the list of concerns raised, there's usually a few things that can be resolved quickly. Many of the other things are big and long-standing, and you'll probably have to set up, an elected official or an agency will have to set up some type of process. But if you want to build trust, knock a few things off the list that can be that can be done immediately.
Great.
And again, and I want to repeat the same thing of don't invite everybody into the meeting either. Go to them and ask. Actually go and listen to people first. Not, hey, we've got a new policy. What do you think about our new policy? I know I'm repeating myself here. Actually go to the community and say, what do you care about right now? What's on your minds? And they'll tell you.
Those are such good points. And you're getting some good feedback in the chat as well, Mike. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Folks, please do put questions if you have them in the chat or in the Q&A. If I don't see more, I'll just keep asking them. One other question I have, so to this issue of the future of our downtowns, what should we be thinking about, and specifically through an equity lens, given that many of these places historically have not been affordable places to live? What should we be doing now to make sure that as we try to bring people back into downtowns, to the extent that we've lost them, that we're making it as equitable as possible? It's a tough question. I don't have the answer to this one, but if either of you have thoughts, what should we be thinking about?
I think that one of the things that is why people go to downtowns apart from the work commute is because the experience of being in proximity to other people. And there are, there's a mix of commercial and non-commercial activities in a downtown area that feel vital and engaging to people. And investing in that is worthwhile, and trying to figure out a way to do that in a way that you open up business opportunities for people. When you mentioned the recession, this would have been, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and everybody around, 2008 and on. A program in the city of Seattle was we managed to open up empty storefronts for artists. One person had a pinball collection they wanted to show off. And what was the pinball museum is now an ongoing business. People come in, pay a flat fee, play all the pinball machines and drink, but just anything to fill the storefronts in ways that, and really look at your processes for people to open up and engage in commerce downtown. That, what are the barriers to small businesses working, and particularly, the ones that then are going to keep out your immigrant entrepreneurs who are really going to make a place work. So I think that's one piece of it. The other one is the housing issue remains huge. If you really want your city to succeed, you need to build more housing. And I still don't get why, every elected official, for what it's worth, should be for adding people to their downtowns, because you got a whole bunch of things you need to pay for. And every person who moves in downtown is going to help build the tax base and help you keep your libraries open and provide social services and all the rest. So this opposition to housing is based on, some type of fear and suspicion of what growth will mean, but it really is important, particularly in these downtowns that we're relying on, suburban commuters to fuel the local economy. Like, figure out how to start building housing down there and make sure that a big chunk of it's affordable for people that want to live closer to their jobs. I mean, we spend billions of dollars literally building convention centers. Imagine if we spent billions of dollars building affordable housing in the core of cities again, like maybe we did decades ago.
Great. We have just a couple minutes left. I just want to prompt the audience one more time. Oh. Perhaps we do have a question.
I see someone making the point about pushing for complete neighborhoods across urban areas, putting grocery stores and housing downtown. And, one of the things you see is that if you loosen up your use requirements in your zoning, those types of uses will follow people, generally speaking. Retail follows demand if you allow the retail to operate. And so that's the other thing we see is these use restrictions in places which don't make sense. You were mentioning the use restriction of running a home business, right? That's something that really needs to be loosened up. But the use restrictions in downtown can be, restrictive as well about the types of things. And you look at the examples of the places that built food truck pods and how exciting those were for people to go to. You can look at it from the experience of the visitor, but that's also a lower cost entry point. There's actually a lot of regulations you got to change to allow that. And you have to overcome the opposition of the brick and mortar businesses, right? And there's health department regulations and restaurant rules and curb space rules, but it's really worth fighting through if it means that you can open up those business opportunities to people in the downtown that were previously not available because of the regulatory barriers.
I think I'll just reemphasize, I think, Mike, you said this before, is not only just the restrictions and regulations, but also opening up the processes and making them, more transparent and just more accessible for the folks where you don't have to have a job as a planner to understand how the heck to open your business.
Yeah, some of us thought a taco truck on every corner sounded like a really good idea, and there's a lot to that, and a lot of those places turn into brick and mortar businesses if they're successful, and that's the experience in a lot of cities. So we adopted all these rules. There was probably a good idea behind the rules when it was adopted. The person who advocated for the rule might still be in the city advocating for it. But changed circumstances give you an opportunity to revisit those and kind of clear out the deadwood that prevents you from having a really sustainable, resilient city.
That was great. Thank you both so much. And we are at time, of course. Really appreciated your insights again. And thank you all for joining us and providing your input in the chat. We really appreciate it. Apologies again for the technical issues, but I thought the comments that we got in the chat were wonderful. And we will be including the questions that we didn't get to in a follow-up blog post. So please stay tuned for the recording and for that follow-up blog post. And I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.